Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for April 28th, where we are talking about 28 days later, and we are viewing our very last film of the semester that represents the 2010s. That happens to be Get Out. And we're also talking about some due dates because our last class is next week, believe it or not. And that happens to be May 5th, where I will be talking about Get Out, the film, and also talking about some summary comments and some closure to the semester as a whole. Your final project is due on the 12th of May at 6 p.m. And that would be the time that we would normally be meeting if we were taking the class in person. And that would also be the time that we would be taking the final examination. So I'm going to post the final examination on Wednesday the 12th by 6 p.m. And you've got 24 hours in which to finish that final exam, which is open book, open notes. And you can send that final exam to me via PDF. Much like you've been sending your journals to me as well. And I will get that back to you. In terms of the final, what I'm going to be doing is giving you a series of essay questions and asking you to select two out of the series that I've asked. And basically, if you've been keeping up with the class videos and the readings and the films, it should be a fairly manageable examination, because basically the final exam is just a way for you to synthesize everything that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And think about some of the themes that we've talked about over the course of the semester. For instance, how these films that we've been watching exemplify the fears and anxieties of humanity, and particularly the fears and anxieties of a particular time period. I've been talking about these films in terms of decades. Another thing you can think about is the idea of monstrosity. And monstrare in the Latin means to show. And what is it that we learn and see from all of these monstrosities? Or think about the authoritarian institutions that are critiqued over the course of these films, or even something like the representation of gender over the course of these films. Now, last class, we talked a little bit about Blair Witch Project and how ultimately it's less important what happens with the Blair Witch, and what's more important is what happens to the group that's searching for the Blair Witch, and how they quickly fall apart. And we see that the monstrosity is really within. And that's a theme that we've seen in many of these films. And in times of turmoil and difficulty, rather than groups working together, they become adversaries with one another, which is definitely what we see with something like 28 Days Later. And our text, Projected Fears, had talked about how they thought this film would achieve a kind of cultural status that it hasn't. Perhaps because it was set in Britain. I'm not necessarily sure, but I know that ultimately one of the interesting things about this film and its updated zombie tale is this idea of rage, and that rage is contagious. It's a conversation that we've been having in contemporary times about the idea of racism being contagious and violence being contagious, much like a virus is contagious. And that this hatred and violence is unfortunately universal, and thus far seem to have been timeless. Whether or not our future can be changed. Now, the destruction of the current society, the apocalyptic 2000s, is something that was particularly important for this particular film because of when it was shot, which would have been in the early 2000s. And it was shot before 9/11, but that said, it basically hit theaters after 9/11, and it was quite the chilling tale, because after 9/11 there was a lot of discussion about whether or not we could return to a sense of normalcy. And in fact, this is the kind of conversation that we're having in contemporary times, which was part of the attendance question that I had asked you to consider in terms of this film, which happens to be about a viral outbreak and the consequences of that viral outbreak. What lessons could we learn as a contemporary society. I had asked a very similar question last semester, and almost universally, the response was that we could learn that we need to listen to the scientists. That was a time several months ago when there was a good amount of controversy going on as to whether or not we should listen to the science. Things have changed somewhat politically, so science is less questioned than it was just a few months ago. Many of you have indicated that your lesson from 28 Days Later, if nothing else, is that our current situation could be much, much worse. So we have to be very grateful for what we have. And the film itself is basically not just a critique of media and the government and military and even consumerism. There are all of these shots, for instance, of these billboards and these souvenirs at the beginning of the film when Jim is walking through basically this empty and isolated society. And we see how ultimately, those things are meaningless when he gathers up all of the money. Money and consumerism and products mean nothing in this particular society that has been reduced to basically survival. We learn how the media has stopped giving broadcasts and that the government no longer is in existence, and his disbelief. There's always a government. No, there isn't. And something like the military, which appears to be a possible savior, turns out to be one of the biggest villains in the film itself. So this is an idea that George Romero and others have examined, but if you want to think about 28 Days Later as a retelling of the zombie tale, even though George Romero adamantly maintained that this film has nothing to do with his conception of zombies because this is about a viral outbreak. It's not about a reanimation after death, but the similarities are there certainly in this idea of hordes and basically trying to, in one way or another, envelop the contemporary society, and the need for community, which was something that in Night of the Living Dead we saw how very easily in the farmhouse, which was sort of serving as a surrogate for the Gothic haunted house, since there is a great parallel between the Gothic literary tradition and horror film. We can see that the importance of community and others is very important in this film. And I would argue that the first word that Jim utters, which is hello, is the key, that he's looking for basically others. And at the very ending, we also get the word hello. At first, it looks like it's the word hell. The idea that isolation and lack of community is hell. But hello is the word of hope when we see that there are indeed aircraft that are flying. So the assumption is that the viral outbreak has been contained to England, which happens to be an island nation, and that the rest of society is continuing on. Now, there is a sequel to this film. I have to say I was a bit disappointed with the sequel. I think that the first film is much superior, which is oftentimes the case. But there is a film called 28 Weeks Later, if you are interested in any way in seeing the continuation of this saga. And there were plans to make a film called 28 Months Later, and that was immediately before our viral outbreak. So I don't know where that stands at this particular point in time. One of the more interesting things I think about this film is this creation of a new family unit, a society for survival. And the family unit is basically blind to some of the contemporary ills of our society, such as racism and classism. And that we see how Jim and Selena basically are able to form a coupling, even though they are from different ethnicities and even though both of them are from different classes as well. And perhaps that's the answer, or one of the answers that's embedded within the film, is that if we are going to defeat rage and violence, then we need to be very cautious of the isms in our society, which tend to help promote anger and hostility, which we've seen, unfortunately, rather recently as well in our own contemporary society. There's a scene in the film that I think is quite telling with horses, and the horses are running free, and that also is indicative of the idea. While we as humans tend to be very human centric, and the idea of, well, this must be the ending of the world because our human society is no longer existing in the way in which it normally did. That's not the ending of the world. The world is going on quite nicely without humans. In 28 days later, or some might say that it's doing better without the intervention of humans. That could be another embedded message within it, as we see those horses that are running free, and even the colors of the horses, black and white, I think again are an embedded symbol of the idea that we need to dismantle and destroy the artificial barriers that we've put in our society that have led to violence and discrimination and hatred and ultimately rage. And the fact that a quarantine can be effective, which is what we see in this film, is perhaps an idea that we can take with us in this film, that if we quarantine and do so in a serious way, that our society can survive the challenges that it has. But that particular film, I think, in many ways, sort of represents the fears and anxieties that basically are exhibited at the beginning of any millennium, especially this millennium, which I think I might have mentioned that there were some fears about technology, and I had argued that. Basically, the Blair Witch Project, in my mind, as a film of the 1990s, is very much an examination of technology and the dehumanizing aspects associated with technology, or the possible dehumanizing aspects associated with technology. But in the year 2000, there was a great concern that our technological structures would basically fail. Because of something called the Y2K, that the computers had not been programmed for the 2000s, and the fear is that they would have all frozen once the date moved from 1999 to 2000, and that didn't happen. But of course, 9/11 did happen shortly after the filming of this film, so it made it particularly resonant. And I do remember quite well the anxieties surrounding 9/11 and the fallout afterwards, about what this would mean for our continuation of society. So, Danny Boyle, the director of this film, had talked about that he was inspired by things like mad cow disease, and again, the possibility of viral outbreak. Not that he could have in any way anticipated where we are now with COVID-19. But perhaps in some ways he did anticipate it, in the sense that 28 days later is a cautionary tale about what happens when science runs amok, and also what happens when authoritarian institutions run amok. You could see at the very beginning of the film that science isn't necessarily presented in a positive way, but we can also say that those individuals who are completely firm in their belief that they are doing the right thing by releasing these caged animals are basically doing the wrong thing, and that basically maybe both sides can be wrong at the same time. And if you are a fan of Clockwork Orange, then probably that initial scene will be reminiscent of Clockwork Orange to you, where you basically got a chimp that is tied down and is being forced to view images of violence on the media. Again, another commentary about what happens when we are surrounded with images of violence and hate, and also what happens when technology basically becomes our reality, and that it completely leads to a dysfunction. The film Get Out came out in 2017, and it was a mix of horror and comedy. If you are familiar with the comedian Jordan Peele, then you know some of his comedy routines. And one of the things that many of you have indicated in terms of watching these films is the lack of representation in these films. And one of the things that Jordan Peele wanted to do was to give us a lens of horror through the African American experience. And I think he was able to do so very successfully. He talks a little bit about how he wanted to do that in response to some of the politics that were going on during the time period where Barack Obama was president, and there was this hope and assumption that perhaps that meant that America had moved beyond racism. And of course, after Barack Obama, we saw how the country had to deal with some very ugly truths about race. And in fact, we were dealing with those ugly truths in many respects during his presidency, which is what Jordan Peele was alluding to, but certainly after his presidency as well. So this is very much, I think, a commentary on the 2010s and the American monster, and that the American monster ultimately is our history of slavery and the racism that's resulted because of it. Now, one of the things about Get Out that was so interesting, well, there are many things that are about Get Out that are interesting. It's a very literary film, and it's gotten a good amount of accolades as well, which is unusual for a horror film. But one of the more interesting things that I wanted us to consider about Get Out is the alternate ending that Jordan Peele had almost used. And he decided he didn't want to use that alternate ending. So what I've got here is a website for Get Out, and as I had indicated, I'm having increasing difficulties finding websites that are for free for these more contemporary films. So certainly you can use some of my suggestions, or you can end up finding the film Get Out on your own, whether it be through Amazon or Netflix or another vehicle. Or if it turns out that it's impossible for you to get that film, please contact me, because I will be able to give you an access code that would allow you to view that particular film. If you don't already own it, my suspicion is many of you are horror film fans and you might have seen this film or own this film, and I really do encourage you to own this particular film. Every time I watch it, I see something new. It really is brilliant in terms of its use of imagery and its use of metaphor. But today's attendance question, which will be due next Wednesday, is: do you prefer the film ending or the alternate ending of Get Out? And you can see that I've put the YouTube link for the alternate ending of Get Out. So do you prefer the film ending or the alternate ending of Get Out, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will finish up next class, any odds and ends, with 28 days later. And then we will continue with talking about Get Out, and then finally put some closure to the semester as a whole. So take care and enjoy Get Out. Take care.